Brothers and sisters, let me invite you to stand as we read the gospel lesson, which today comes from Matthew 21, 23 through 32. This passage comes late in the gospel. The tension is building. All of the ministry that Jesus has done is leading to this moment in Jerusalem, a moment of great joy, but also a moment of great tension. And so we read the narrative as we hear about this tension building. When Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will ask you also one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they argued with one another, "Well, if we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why didn't you believe him?' But if we say of human origin, we're afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." He answered, "I will not." But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second son and said the same, and he answered, "I go, sir." But he did not go. Which of the 2 sons did the will of his father? They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the realm of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. You've seen this movie before. You've seen the outsider who's making waves, and then those people who are in authority are cutting him or her down to size. It's the plot of, what, all Western movies, starting Clint Eastwood in a one-street town, complete with a confrontation in, what, a saloon or a shootout in the main drag. Is the plot of the high school drama, Karate Kid, with the awkward teenager trying to stand his or her ground against the bullying or the popular crowd. It's the plot of a crime drama. Do you remember Serpico? With the spunky cop or detective who's trying to do the right thing, even if the police brass don't like it. It's the outsider who is without honor, without standing, without position, without authority, and he or she is going up against the people who have all of those things. That plot fits 2 biblical characters in particular, John the Baptist and Jesus, as we read about today. And in today's gospel, both John and Jesus are brought up, John in absentia and Jesus face to face with the authorities. In the run-up to today's passage, as I was trying to tell you that there had been some tension building up, there were these events that had taken place that were very much in the minds of people as they heard Jesus have this conversation with the religious authorities. For one, John the Baptist had just been killed by the Romans. John the Baptist had been a very troubling figure for the religious establishment because He was bringing a prophet's message, saying that God was telling the people to turn around, that they were going the wrong way, that they needed to repent. And that didn't fit into their picture of the power structure neatly. While the authorities didn't like the message, as you heard in this passage, they knew that John had a following. And they knew that they didn't want to upset the crowd because the crowd would go against them. And so they didn't dare touch him. It would actually be up to the Romans to squelch that troubling figure, and did so violently. The Romans didn't play any games. They had John killed when he crossed Herod. Another event that had just happened was that Jesus had just been to the temple, and remember, he had overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple compound. This act, which could have been seen as vandalism or quite possibly as treasonous, had taken place just before. And I would argue that, and maybe you would argue back, but I would argue this actually was a peaceful confrontation, even though it required that physical upturning or confrontation of the corruption in the temple. But what was amazing for me is that Jesus wasn't arrested right then and there when he did that. He was not hauled off to jail. He was not killed by the authorities at that point because they were afraid of his following. Because the people were liking what Jesus was saying, and the authorities knew it, and they were biding their time. Only it would eventually be the Romans who would kill Jesus because he crossed Pilate. Both of these troublemakers, John and Jesus, were upsetting the system. The religious authorities had it in for them, but those who were in power were backing off because these troublemakers were building their power base. Revenge of the Nerds. Look it up. And we might as well bring in Moses, because Moses had been the unlikeliest of leaders to take the people out of Egypt from slavery. He was an outsider himself, twice over. And so he was asked by God to deliver the Israelites. And now that he had done it, they're in the desert and they're dying of thirst, and they look to Moses and basically say, "Why did you bring us out of here to kill us?" Moses' authority was being challenged, and what Moses says, "Search me. God told me to bring you here." The authority comes from somewhere else. So back to the tension with the passage in the gospel. Here's the in crowd, the crowd in power, the religious authorities, and they want to cut Jesus down to size. So they try to shame him with a question that they asked him about the authority. But he's a rabbi, so they had to do that very carefully. The confrontation we witness is actually not a rude confrontation in the way that it might have sounded initially. But this is a conversation about the right and wrong. This is about who's wielding real power. And this kind of back and forth with questions is actually how the rabbis would have resolved differences of opinion about a particular passage or about a particular understanding of the scriptures. It was question versus question, and they would go back and forth. And the trick was to get your enemy to answer your question in the way you wanted them to answer it. To trap them, to paint them into a corner where there was only one answer, yours. And those who were in authority didn't like the way in which he was presenting situations to them, especially when he was talking about John the Baptist. And they said, "Well, we don't know." And then he hits them with that parable. He forces them to answer a question that they didn't want to answer, which basically says that they were being hypocritical and they were being disobedient to God. He wasn't making any friends that day. On a Sunday like today, when we think about and we financially support the ministry of the peace and global witness of the Presbyterian Church around the world on this Communion Sunday, on this World Communion Sunday, we ponder together about how we live out that call of Jesus to challenge the powers that be with the authority that comes from God. What I want you to notice is that Jesus didn't take the bait of the authoritarian effort of the authorities. He didn't take their method. Jesus' authority and power wasn't about brutal force, wasn't about political wrangling, but it was about grounding of his actions in God's message for the people. And in that sense, there's a twist in this movie. Here's the underdog for whom we've been cheering. But this underdog is not out to outgun the opposition or outsmart or outmaneuver the enemy. Instead, Jesus is standing nonviolently on the message of God's unstoppable love for all. Our vision as Christians to stand for peacemaking on this World Communion Sunday, whether in our community or abroad, is an effort to take an active, courageous stand which changes the rules of the game, overturns the rules of the game. And so if some question our authority for standing with undocumented immigrants, let's say, we proclaim that God asks us to welcome one another, especially immigrants. If some bristle at how we decry the status quo of poor people in our community, we proclaim that Jesus lived with them, ate with them, lodged with them, advocated for them as equals. And if we get sideways with some people who, when we seek justice for the oppressed in Palestine, because they're asking for more military buildup, we remind them, we proclaim that God asks us to melt our swords and turn them into plowshares. The improbable ending of this movie is that the pushed out are lifted up, that the forgotten are embraced, and that the peacemakers are lifted up and vindicated, and those holding on to God's authority transform a congregation, a community, and a world. And for that we give God thanks.